Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Offshore Wind Turbine Radar Interference Mitigation. My name is Alex Lemke, and I'll be your organizer today. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You should have an attendee interface on the right-hand side of your screen. This is where you'll be executing listening and questions. If you're listening today in your computer speaker system by default. However, if you would prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. Please choose only one option, not both. You will have the opportunity to submit questions today by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will collect those to address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. As a reminder, all attendees will be muted throughout the duration of the webinar, so the question box is pivotal. I would now like to introduce Patrick Gilman, the Program Manager of DOE's Wind Energy Technologies Office. Patrick?
Thanks, Alex. Good morning, everyone. This is Patrick Gilman. I'm a program manager with the U.S. Department of Energy's Wind Energy Technologies Office, and I'd like to welcome you to this second in a series of technical interchange meetings, virtual conversations around offshore wind radar interference mitigation. As a reminder, we're putting together this series as a replacement to an in-person workshop that was to be held alongside the Offshore Wind International Partnering Forum in Providence, Rhode Island, that we were, for obvious reasons, obliged to cancel. This webinar series is sponsored by the Federal Wind Turbine Interference Mitigation Working Group, which is a group of federal agencies co-chaired by the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense, but also includes FAA, NOAA, Coast Guard, BOEM, and a number of other agencies working together with the goal of addressing the potential impact of wind development on radars and the federal missions that depend on them, and ensure ultimately that wind energy and radar missions can effectively coexist. And we do that through coordination of research and development. The goals of this webinar series is to help us, particularly around offshore wind issues, where we have a little bit less experience and we have some time, hopefully, to get ahead of them before there are substantial numbers of turbines in the water. The goals of this webinar series are to build relationships between agencies, industry, and other stakeholders around these issues, to promote dialogue and a shared understanding of wind turbine radar interference mitigation around offshore wind, and ultimately to identify research and development needs to address these impacts. Next slide, please. Today, we're going to be focusing on how wind turbine radar interference plays into the offshore wind regulatory process that is managed, overseen by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management within the Department of the Interior. And to that end, after I'm finished giving my introduction, we'll have Jim Bennett, who's the Renewable Energy Program Manager at BOEM, talking about how the project of review and approval process, how wind turbine radar interference issues are included in that. And following on his presentation, we'll have a panel discussion with a number of folks from other agencies to explore those issues in more depth from each of their perspectives. So we'll have additional representatives from BOEM, DOD, Coast Guard, NOAA, and the American Wind Energy Association to give an industry perspective. Each of those panelists will give a brief introduction, and then we'll run through a dialogue and start mixing in your questions, and then turn the floor over to your questions and work through those for probably about an hour. And then finally, I will give a quick wrap up, and then provide some information on the next webinar. One quick note on housekeeping. We received a lot of questions on our last session related to the impacts of wind development on marine navigation radars, particularly those used by commercial fishermen and other folks operating out there in the marine environment. We may touch on those issues a little bit in the dialogue today, but we'll not be focusing on those in depth. So if you have specific questions about marine radars, please send them our way and we'll figure out how to address them in an upcoming webinar. Speaking of which, and I'll get back to this at the end, but just to show you where we are in the series again, today we're going to be looking at how wind turbine radar interference issues play into the federal regulatory process around offshore wind. The next couple of webinars in June and tentatively July will be focused on the technical impacts of offshore wind on different classes of radar systems, and how what the state of understanding is around those impacts and how they can be mitigated. And then finally in the fall sometime, we're hoping either in person, if that's possible, or on another virtual session to get into a dialogue around radar interference mitigation research and development needs, so that the federal working group can get on with funding solutions and collaborating with industry and other stakeholders to do that. This is very much a work in progress. We're all quite familiar with the process of it going through and having in-person workshops and posting Federal Register notices and the like to solicit input from stakeholders. But this virtual meeting series is a new experiment for us. And so we'd very much like to hear your input on how we can improve it along the way, and so we can incorporate that feedback into future sessions. Lily Gobrial from DOE is our coordinator in that respect, and her email is on the screen now. We'd very much like to hear from you on how we can improve this series going forward. Next slide. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim Bennett, the program manager from the Office of Renewable Energy in BOEM, to give us an overview of the regulatory process and how these issues fit into it. Jim?
Thank you, Patrick. Hopefully you can hear me. My name again is Jim Bennett. I'm the program manager for the Office of Renewable Energy Programs at the U.S. Department of the Interior, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. I want to thank everybody for this opportunity to speak and give you a background in what we do at Interior for the offshore energy program, renewable energy program. I'm going to be giving you a federal perspective. We are a federal agency, a bureau perspective. And I want to note that Jen Miller, our subject matter expert for radar issues, is on the line and will be available during the panel session to address any specifics with regard to radar. First, hello. Can I be heard? Can people hear me?
You out for a second there. We can hear you now.
Just for a second. Okay, good. So I won't repeat all the introduction. My slides do not seem to be advancing on any buttons.
Alex, could you jump in and take over the slide parts, and Jim, if you wouldn't mind, just asking Alex to advance those slides, Alex, if you're able to do that. And thank you folks for bearing while we figure this out.
Sure. If we could advance to the next slide. There we go. Hold on. Just for now, I just want to mention that we operate under the OCS Lands Act, which was established way back in the 70s, or actually back in the 50s. And as you're probably familiar, it's very focused on the oil and gas resource. But in 2005, it was amended to allow us to pursue energy from sources other than oil and gas. I want to mention that we have 4 offices. Click if you would. First in Alaska, where they're looking at the possibility of oil and gas exploration both in the Arctic and in Cook Inlet. We have a Pacific office, which has legacy oil and gas activities, but is also has great prospects for wind energy, which we'll talk about a little bit. The Gulf of Mexico, which produces 25% of the domestic energy production in the U.S., and the Atlantic, which is a very, very high potential area for renewable energy. If you could click one more time. And the reason the Atlantic is so promising is because the fundamental needs for successful offshore wind are in place. If you could click. The first is indeed the wind resource itself. And as you can see from this map, which I need to update, but the National Renewable Energy Labs has identified that both the East Coast and the West Coast in the US are world-class wind resource areas. And when you combine that with the next slide, if you would, the technology that we currently have, which is bottom-founded technology, which you can see on the left-hand side there, fits very, very well with our Atlantic environment where we have a shallow sloping shelf. The Pacific region has great potential, but because the shelf drops off so quickly, it very likely will need to be, or will be needing to use floating technology, which is coming along, but isn't quite there yet. And the third piece, of course, the next slide, which is critical, is click one more time if you would, is markets. And you can see there's markets on the West Coast and there's tremendous markets on the East Coast, of course, from Richmond, Washington, all the way up through Boston. And you can also see, if you could click, please, you can also see that in this area in the Northeast, we have a very substantial amount of leases. We have 16 leases, and we also have some planning areas that we're considering for additional leasing. So those factors all come together in a way that has put us in a place after 10 years to have steel in the water, which we anticipate next month off of Virginia, and considerable development over the coming decade. You can click, please. But it isn't just, click again if you would, it is not just these fundamental components that are necessary. We also need state leadership, click if you would, and that is demonstrated very effectively by Rhode Island's Block Island project, the first offshore wind farm in US waters. And other states are also realizing and moving forward with very aggressive goals, if you would click, for renewable energy, particularly these states in the Northeast. And these renewable goals, click please, translate into very specific offshore wind goals, including 9 gigawatts for the state of New York, 7.5 for the state of New Jersey. Massachusetts has identified a goal of 3.2. But more importantly, if you would click, they've gone beyond these goals and identified offtake potentials that make the areas much more viable in the marketplace. We've got 12 megawatts of offtake identified, either awarded or scheduled, and half of that, or roughly half of that, is already awarded. So we're moving along very quickly with a combination of federal activities on the leasing side and state activities on the offtake side. Click, please. I want to talk a little bit about process so that we have an idea of what we're looking at. This is not a small undertaking. A wind farm is a project of a magnitude of $3 to $4 billion. It does not happen overnight. We start, click, with planning and analysis, where we work with the states and the public. Click, please. And we have established intergovernmental state task forces in most of the East Coast states, as well as California and Hawaii, and I think Oregon as well. And the process begins with collecting information through these state task forces and contacts, and identifying areas where we put out a call for information and nominations, and identify an area consistent with the information that we have and the desires of the respective states, and do environmental reviews on moving forward with conducting a lease. Click, if you would. The leasing process takes 1 to 2 years, including the proposal of a sale notice and a final sale notice and qualification of bidders, and an actual auction, followed by the issuance of leases to the winners of that auction. That auction, the winners of that auctions get a 5-year period in which to conduct site characterization in accordance with an approved site assessment plan to identify more specifically the wind resource and the seafloor conditions and other variables that would affect their proposal of a construction and operations plan. That construction and operations plan is what they propose to actually build. If you could click, please. And it is upon approval, which can take up to 2 years. They follow it up with more detailed facility design report and a fabrication and installation report, and the provisions and accommodations for decommissioning. Construction can take in the neighborhood of 2 years and then operates for another 25 or so, depending upon the lease. The next slide shows the same information in a timeline format with the same turnaround intervals. But the important point in this is the ability for stakeholder engagement throughout the process at every step of the way, from area ID in the planning and analysis phase, all the way to approval of the construction and operations plan, which is subject to an environmental impact statement under the National Environmental Policy Act. If you would click, please. So what have we got going? Like I said, we've got 16 leases on the East Coast. Click, if you would. Over the course of the, well, to begin with, we're expecting steel in the water, the first steel in the water for the CVOW project, the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project off of Virginia Beach. Click, if you would. And that's going to be next month. And after that, on those 16 leases that we currently have, we're looking at a dozen or 15 or maybe even more specific projects to be developed over the course of the next decade. It's going to be a very exciting time for offshore wind and a very exciting time for us. And of course, we're looking forward to the challenge of keeping up with all the activities that are going to occur. And that, of course, is just on existing leases. We're also considering other areas, which I'll get to in just a moment. If you could click, please. Just to give you an idea of the activities that we're currently involved in. This is going to require several clicks. First off, we have the 8 completed lease sales. And as a result of those lease sales, we have 16 active offshore leases that have been issued, all of them on the East Coast. We've approved 8 site assessment plans, and we have approved 1 general activities plan, which is essentially a construction and operations plan for a research project, which is what the CVOW project is. But we also, on construction and operations plans, have 7 projects currently under review, and we anticipate another 3 to 5 in the coming year. So we're going to have our plate full on construction and operations plans review and approval. We've got 10 guidance documents out there right now, and we've got 5 additional areas under consideration for more leasing, and that includes additional leasing in the New York Bight area, potential leasing in the Gulf of Maine, potential leasing off of Carolina, and then out on the West Coast off of California and off of Hawaii. Again, we anticipate steel in the water. This is a big event for us on the Outer Continental Shelf next year off of Virginia. Click, please. I just want to mention there are a number of issues and opportunities, the first of which is employment. There's a tremendous amount of potential employment associated with the construction of a typical commercial wind farm in the neighborhood of 10,000 FTEs. We have industrial synergies that can go on between the Gulf of Mexico, and this picture here is of the foundations for the Block Island project, which were built in Louisiana using offshore oil and gas technology. And that's a great opportunity for us to move forward. Technology is advancing both in terms of transmission, but also in terms of the size and capabilities of the turbines, which is driving down costs. Click. We have issues that we need to address in terms of other users, including commercial and recreational fishing, which we'll talk to a little bit more over the course of the panel. There's a lot of concern about view sheds and visual impacts and the potential loss of revenue in coastal resort areas, which we need to address. And navigation and safety, of course, is one of the primary considerations in identifying where these wind farms can go in the first place. So that remains a very big issue. And then last but not least on this list, I'm sorry, wildlife, of course, with the northern right whale, and then transmission issues. What is not, if you can click, please. What is not on this list, because it's not so much in the public arena, is the radar issues that we're going to be talking about today. But they are indeed a factor in identifying areas that we can move forward with. Click, please. I just want to mention that these decisions are not made in a vacuum. We've had a program of environmental studies that's been going on for about 5 decades now. And we collect a lot of information about the environment and potential impacts from various activities, oil and gas, of course, but specifically for renewable energy, we've expended in the neighborhood of 47 million on a variety of topics here. If you can click to the next slide. Those topics are not all environment. We have a couple of studies on radar, and I just want to mention that we have the one on Atlantic lease areas, mitigation study. Click a couple times if you would. Took us as far as identifying the BOEM lease areas within radar line of sight, and identified the potential for mitigations, including infill and curtailment. To make a long story short, I think the key thing here is that developers need to work very closely with radar operators and coordinate to ensure that we don't have adverse impacts that could otherwise be avoided. I also want to mention the high frequency, we'll go back one just a second, impact assessment of high frequency coastal radar. And if, I guess in the interest of time, let us continue moving. And like I said, any specific questions we'll handle in the Q&A session. But if you would click, I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I look forward to the panel and the questions that are going to be addressed. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Jim. So next, we're going to do a quick roundtable with the panel. I'm going to ask each panelist in turn to give a brief introduction of where they fit into the picture that Jim just outlined as far as the project review and approval process goes, and outline their specific equities when it comes to radar interference in that process. First up, we have Steve Sample from the DoD Siting Clearinghouse.
Thank you, Patrick. And thank you, everybody, for participating in this. The clearinghouse, we gave a quick summary last time of all of our issues. So just as a brief introduction today, I'll mention that the clearinghouse coordinates DoD's efforts to ensure that development is planned in a manner that is compatible with military missions. And we do that by organizing the efforts of all DoD stakeholders into three primary areas. One, working directly with industry and other departments. Two, developing mitigation strategies, either procedural or technical. And then three, reviewing and responding to specific proposals in a variety of venues. And all three of those areas are relevant and part of today's discussion. So I look forward to the Q&A. And with that, over.
All right, I guess it's my turn. My name is Derek Snowden. I'm the Chief of Operations at the Integrated Ocean Observing System program, which is in NOAA's National Ocean Service. And we're an interagency program for which NOAA is the lead federal agency, and our mission is to produce and integrate and communicate ocean and Great Lakes information to meet the safety and economic and stewardship needs of the nation. We do that by directly observing the state of the ocean and Great Lakes environment and by integrating data and models from across the coastal landscape. That's federal systems, academic systems, state systems, et cetera. And then all this information is integrated into modeling and analysis systems to produce decision support tools. We operate a little bit differently than many other federal programs in that the primary implementers of our observing systems are scientists and engineers, managers, et cetera, from academia, nonprofits, and the private sector. They are not NOAA employees. So NOAA provides base funding to support to serve as a foundation for these regional associations to build on. But the implementers, as I said, are from the private sector and academia primarily. High frequency coastal radars are a critical component of our overall observing system, and the slide shows the current configuration of our network. They're the only instrument capable of making both high resolution spatial and temporal observations of the surface currents over the continental shelf. And currently we have about 150 stations. The surface current data obtained from this network is invaluable for a bunch of applications. Primarily, U.S. Coast Guard uses the surface current estimates for boosting reliability and narrowing the search areas for people and vessels adrift at sea. NOAA's Office of Response and Restoration uses this to help focus oil spill cleanup and prediction efforts. Recently, the National Weather Service has begun evaluating a secondary product from the radar network for wave measurements, significant wave heights for marine forecast operations, detecting tsunamis and media tsunamis, and there's these radars have shown promise for wind measurements and even vessel detection. So it's a multi-purpose network, and we'll talk a little bit later about how the interference from the wind systems are being addressed. Back to you.
Great, thank you, Derek. George from Coast Guard.
Good morning, Patrick. Good morning, all on the webinar. I'm actually going to wear two hats for this small presentation. First of all, my Coast Guard hat and our roles and responsibilities. I tried to narrow them down to basically, in a nutshell, we exist to protect all mariners of all types. Everything from the wreck boater all the way up to, in theory, aircraft carriers and things like that. We also are to protect property at sea, which does include the wind farms. So we have to take that into account. And of course, as most of the government agencies, we're out to protect the environment. In addition, we need to promote the marine transportation system and maintain it and ensure safe routing to and from our ports. The United States receives plenty of goods from the shipping. In fact, I've heard numbers between 80 and 90% of our goods shipped in and out of the country obviously depend on that MTS. As a role with BOEM, we are a cooperating agency. The Energy Policy Act of 2005, as Jim mentioned, the specific section in there says the Secretary of the Department of Interior will consult with the Secretary of the Department in which the Coast Guard is operating, which in this case is obviously DHS, And within DHS, they have delegated us to look at the maritime domain. As a cooperating agency, we'll provide information when BOEM goes through their NEPA process concerning safety and navigation, the traditional uses of the particular waterway, and any other Coast Guard missions and how they may be impacted, such as search and rescue, marine environmental protection, or security. We do have some concern, and I'll just touch on it now, with structures impacting radars. We know what they do. We've done some studies of European studies, and hopefully working together, we can protect the mariners from those type of radar interference. Second hat I'm wearing real quick is the other half of the department, which has the air domain, which is really CBP. But that falls down to the Domain Awareness Standards and Analysis Office, was formerly the Long Range Radar Joint Program Office, and their requirements are to perform evaluations and vetting of the wind turbine applications, ensuring the DHS's air domain awareness equities are protected. They're also increasing the persistent wide area surveillance all the way down to 100 feet AGL. CBP and the Coast Guard will collaborate on impacts to maritime domain awareness. We will work together and make sure we're feeding the right information to BOEM as needed. And lastly, CBP is expanding persistent maritime surveillance literally around the country, the Great Lakes, Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean area, and both coasts. And I think that's the end of my presentation. Thank you, Patrick.
Great. Quick acronym checks there, George. CBP is Customs and Border Protection, yes?
Yes.
Great. Next up, we have Tom Vinson from the American Wind Energy Association. Tom, can you give an industry perspective on this issue?
Hey, everybody. Just quickly on AWEA. AWEA is the National Trade Association of both land-based and offshore wind-focused companies. We have 1,000 member companies, including project developers, operators, construction firms, manufacturers of all types, financial institutions, et cetera. For purposes of today's conversation, we engage in policy advocacy on behalf of all of the Atlantic Coast offshore wind leaseholders, along with several offshore project developers who have not yet been awarded leases. We do not, however, work on individual projects. And I personally have been working on the wind energy radar interference issues with many folks on this call for more than 12 years. And I'll get into it more in the Q&A, but I think industry is looking for process and technological solutions to address these issues. We've made a lot of progress in the land-based space and have no reason to expect that it will be a significant barrier in the offshore space either. But I would caution, Patrick, you mentioned we have some time in your intro. There are a number of projects that hope to be in construction as early as 2021 or 2022. So while their in-service dates are a little ways off, their construction dates are not. So I think we do all need to work together with a fairly strong sense of urgency.
Great, thank you, Tom. And I think the fact that we're holding this webinar series and the work that we're doing in the federal interagency side, we're quite clear on the fact that we have to have a fire lit here to figure these things out now. So thank you for the reminder on that front. So now we're going to move to a panel Q&A. I mentioned in my introduction that we'll start with some questions that the panelists have come up with for each other. As your questions come in as they're topical, based on what we're talking about in the dialogue, I'll start mixing them in, and then when we get through ours, we'll make sure to leave plenty of time at the end so that we leave time for dialogue with you and the audience. To head one thing off, we've received several questions related to whether this session or the presentations that folks have given will be available. We plan on posting the presentations very shortly after this webinar, probably in the next week or so. And then as soon as we can do all of the things that we need to do to make sure that the recording is compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act, we will post the webinar, an associated transcript, and all of that kind of material. That'll all be available on DOE's website. And Alex or Lily, if you could let people know where they will be able to find those in the chat of the webinar, that would be great. So to start off, I think one note of housekeeping, folks who are familiar with this issue will notice that this panel is not complete from the perspective of all of the different kinds of radar systems that the federal government manages or that might be impacted by wind turbine radar interference. So for example, we don't have folks from the National Weather Service to talk about the NEXRAD weather radar systems, and we don't have folks from the FAA to talk about their equity specific to air traffic control operations. One thing I think that's important when talking about the offshore context is that the regulatory process for this issue is slightly different. For land-based wind, FAA looks at or evaluates all structures over 200 feet above ground level, as well as within proximity to airports, for their impacts on navigation or airspace navigation. Their authority to that issue, which sort of into which all of the other radar interference issues end up flowing, their authority extends just out to 12 nautical miles from the coast. And so BOEM, for the purposes of most of these offshore wind farms, which are located or proposed for farther out than that, is going to be the lead agency. So just first to get into how all of these agency pieces fit together into the BOEM process, Jim, would you speak generally to how you have or are planning on coordinating specifically around these issues with FAA, DOD, GHS, and NOAA, the agencies that have spoken here on radar interference?
Sure, Patrick. Thank you. It's a great question. And you mentioned about jurisdiction. And yes, indeed, FAA has jurisdiction to 12 miles. As far as radar and other concerns go, our jurisdiction extends from the state 3-mile limit out to 200 miles. And as you mentioned, a lot of our projects will be beyond the 12 miles. Within that 12-mile limit, of course, we're going to be looking to follow FAA direction beyond the 12-mile limit, although we are indeed the resource management agency and we have jurisdiction. We will be looking to the FAA, but also all other sources of best available information in order to make decisions about radar potentials, radar potential conflicts. I do want to mention that we have a number of different mechanisms for different agencies to be involved. We consider this a very open and public process, and all of the federal agencies are able to be part of that process at the various stages, such as area ID, lease sale notices, and comment periods and plan reviews. But we also have ongoing communication with other federal agencies as might be needed. First off, as a federal agency, several federal agencies are cooperating agencies in our NEPA process, and we also have a subgroup under White House auspices that we would invite other federal agencies to be part of and have ongoing communications. So you have the formal communications process, but there's also other mechanisms for a less formal and ongoing communication process. And ultimately, throughout this process, any federal agency that has a stake in what's going on, excuse me, we would be receptive to interaction and hearing from them if their equities are being affected in some way, regardless of the process steps that we'd want to follow or that we will be following. So we have an open process, and we are working and coordinating with the agencies on an ongoing basis.
To the other agencies on that point, can you speak to this issue, how from your experience you've been coordinating with BOEM and these issues and how that's gone?
Patrick, this is Steve from DoD. I can go first if you like. So DoD works with BOEM and developers early on as informally as we can, and then as things become more formal, we start to document things a bit differently. But we do start when BOEM is looking at its areas early on, they consult with DoD where we look at what potential concerns would be in different areas, and they're able to build those into the plans that they make available for developers. And then there's many touch points we're learning through this that developers can come to DoD, and we can provide our position, the best information we have with how much detail you have on your projects or the developer's projects at that time. So throughout this, we're working to make sure that BOEM knows the conversations that we're having, and that the developer is aware of where we stand at any given time. And that also includes early on with the informal reviews. Developers can come to us well before a specific area is available or anything like that, just to find out what DoD's concerns might be in a specific area. So one thing that's similar for this to our dealings on land is that in each of these cases, DoD is participating in someone else's authority, right? So there's no time in this where a developer is going to apply to DoD. So the best we can do is be as clear as early as possible as to what the compatibility concerns are for DoD, so that we can get to work together to overcome those before getting to the formal time crunches that we all have later on.
So Steve, one quick follow-up question for you before we kick it to George and Derek on the coordination question. Folks who've been working in this process on offshore wind for many years will know that siting clearinghouse is kind of a new face at the table. Can you speak to how DoD's engagement in the BOEM process has changed and over the years, and how that's come to sit with your office?
Well, sure. The clearinghouse has overseen the energy compatibility process for DoD since just before late 2011. And so we've worked through primarily the FAA process is the most formalized, but whether you're dealing with state, other agency reviews, BLM reviews, or just direct from developer informal reviews, clearinghouse has always been the lead. And we were always involved for offshore projects before, just it was a different face for DoD and where it was handled. And that's just been reorganized a bit over the last year and a half. But everybody that was involved before is still involved. It's just we've kind of reorganized how we introduce ourselves in this. But the clearinghouse is still the point of contact for developers to start the process with DoD. We are by no means the only contact. What we don't want you to have to, a developer, I keep saying you, when I say you, I'm talking, we don't want the developers to have to guess at who within DoD, and Army, Navy, Air Force, Northcom, Southcom, anybody, Missile Defense Agency, anybody in DoD. We don't want developers to have to guess what DoD's concerns would be. So we want you to come to the clearinghouse. We will identify any missions that may have a conflict, and we'll provide you points of contact at those missions. So early on, if you're just having a discussion or you're ready for a discussion, we'll provide you the points of contact so that those discussions can go forward. You can learn what the issues are, learn what's possible to deal with them. And then as we get through the formal stages, the clearinghouse will be the one that documents the results of those discussions. But we don't have to have every phone call come through the clearinghouse. We'll identify those missions for you, and we'll help facilitate those calls as needed. And then when it comes time for formal response, the clearinghouse will be the one that documents those for you. Thanks.
Great, thank you for that, Steve. George, maybe we'll turn to you next. Can you speak to how Coast Guard and DHS more broadly have played into the BOEM process so far, and any observations you'd like to share about how that's gone from the Coast Guard's perspective or DHS's?
Okay, thanks, Patrick. From the Coast Guard perspective, we've been almost from the beginning working with BOEM, and what I mean by that is when BOEM first came out many years ago with the first 4 wind energy areas that they were looking at along the Atlantic coast, we were brought into the fold, and we provided what information we knew at that time, and could we identify any potential impacts, especially to shipping and safety navigation. If the folks can remember Jim's timeline slide, we're involved at every stage, literally from area identification. We start getting involved to the actual lease, to the actual lease area, to the site assessment, because we are the ones that will work with the developer to help identify the best place to put their, or where they'd like to put, if it's okay, their Met tower, their Met buoys. And we also will work with the developer on how to mark and light them so that people don't run into them. And then we will move on and review the site assessment plans for anything that we think might be missing and identify that to both the developer and to BOEM. Eventually, we review the construction and operations plan, and the most specific part of that, not that we don't look at it all, but the most specific part that we look at is the navigation safety risk assessment, which has to be done by the developer. So while the developer is working on that, we will also work with them on an informal basis. When I say them, I meant the developer on an informal basis, because they obviously don't want to come in with a plan that we would be in all consciousness would have to go to BOEM and say, look, we just can't live with that plan for whatever reason. Nobody wants to do that. It slows things down. We want to keep it moving. As far as the department, we are a member of WTRIM, even though our representative just retired. A new person has been assigned to that position, so we're trying to get people up to speed. Again, the department, in a lot of cases, like I said earlier, has divided the air domain and the maritime domain to each of us, to DASA and to us, to cover the maritime. So again, we work with BOEM and the developers literally from the beginning all the way to the fact that BOEM has issued their ROD, record of decision, and steel can start to go in the water. One side note is we also work with the developers on mitigation identification, such as marking and lighting, painting, numbering, lettering, those type of things. We work very early on because we are the agency that has to approve private aids to navigation facilities, lights and sound signals and those type of things. So we will work with the developer as well on what that plan, that Payton plan would look like. So I think about all I have, Patrick.
Great, thank you, George. So Derek, turning to you and to NOAA, the ocean side of NOAA now, we know the HF radar issue that you spoke about is something that has sort of quickly been climbing up our sort of ladder of priorities, so to speak, as we come to learn about the potential impacts to those systems, as well as how they fit into a number of agency missions. So can you speak a little bit to how your part of NOAA has begun working in the process? And then Jim, following on that, if you wouldn't mind just sort of reiterating how you guys are addressing both kind of NOAA radar issues more broadly, but also how more generally you're getting new agency issues into the mix of things that you're working on. So Derek first.
Sure, Patrick. So maybe first a little bit about how the radar works. It relies on backscattering of the radio waves off of the ocean waves, and it travels right closely confined to the surface. So they reflect off the surface ocean waves, and the surface ocean waves themselves are moving, and they're on top of ocean currents. And so by measuring the Doppler shift in the return signal, we can get an estimate of what the surface currents are doing, and possibly derive other things that I mentioned before, surface waves and nearshore winds. So that's the basic premise of the instrument, and how it's being impacted by the antennas that are, or by the wind turbines. Some of this interference was noted, I think probably the first place was in Liverpool Bay in the UK. And since that time, BOEM has actually initiated the research into quantifying the impact and initial mitigation techniques. So they had two studies, one that's complete and one that's ongoing, to try to understand the impact based on the relatively simple Block Island wind farm, and then to develop some simulation capabilities to try to figure out how to pull the true signal that we're looking for, the ocean currents, out of the return that includes the interference. So that's our basic engagement so far. It's really been at a more scientific level. I mentioned that a lot of our operators are academics and private sector companies, and so the pool of operators is relatively small. So when BOEM set out to fund some research, it was the same kind of group of researchers that we fund for operations. So I'd say our collaboration is really at the grassroots level, and as we pick up the work that they have funded previously and fund that going forward, we're looking for more tighter integration with BOEM on mitigation techniques, success, and that sort of thing.
Great, thanks, Derek. So, Jim, can you speak to how you all both are looking at working with NOAA more broadly, as well as working to integrate these kinds of emerging issues that agencies are bringing up into your process? Jim, you may still be on mute.
Yeah, I'm bouncing back and forth between my mute and the organizer mute, but I think I'm unmuted now. And to answer your question, first off, I want to thank and note that we do have very good collaboration, I think, with the other federal agencies that are involved in this overall process, including DOD and Coast Guard and NOAA, of course. We are open not only on radar issues, but any other issues that come up. We have a responsibility to address them, and we do so through every step of our process, most notably the NEPA process, but also in the area identification process and the like. I mentioned in our in the presentation earlier about the environmental studies program that we have. And we have done a couple of radar studies under that. But as these issues arise, we have the opportunity, depending upon priority, to focus some monies, not only from the environmental program, but from a small amount of money from our technology assessment program to address the issues like the ones that Derek has brought up. So as these issues arise, and they are indeed critical to making good choices for offshore wind development, we will focus attention on studies that help answer some of the questions to move the industry forward.
Great, thank you for that. And then just one last question on the sort of process side. Jim, if you could speak to, in a little bit more depth, how you adjudicate these the concerns of the different agencies and come to some kind of decision on how they'll be reflected in folks, if when you're not speaking, if you could mute, getting some feedback. So Jim, just asking if you could.
I can hear that.
Jim, just asking if you could get into
It's
a little
really
bit
loud.
more.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you can hear this.
Patrick, I think I'm talking over somebody,
Loud
but
on the screen too. I got kicked off the webinar somewhere.
Brian and Alex, we can hear you. You're on an open mic. So Jim, can you speak to how you all reach with the other agencies final decisions on how these issues and mitigations get reflected in lease stipulations or other conditions that end up in the formal decision making around how and whether a project can move forward?
Right. It's a good question, and it's often asked in anticipation of a very rigid and clear algorithm, if you will, of adding together different factors and coming up with an answer. What it is the interaction that goes on with different agencies and the subject matter experts to identify not just the areas where we can or can't lease, but also if we do lease, what mitigation needs to occur. It's an ongoing process with all of the agencies involved. If indeed mitigation can be identified or impacts avoided in discussions, for example, with DOD or with NOAA, that will typically, if it's a non-controversial issue, it'll be typically incorporated into mitigating measures that are associated with the approval of the construction and operations plan. Otherwise, we also will be looking at different alternatives where some tough choices need to be made. We'll be looking at different alternatives in the National Environmental Policy Act document, the EIS, which would where tough choices need to be made between one alternative and another. But insofar as impacts can be avoided in consultation with the different parties involved, with the other federal agencies, that's the course of action that we prefer to take, and it's the one that's more effective in the long run.
Great, thank you for that, Jim, and to all the panelists on this part of the conversation. I think I'm going to move now to talking about how the agencies in coordination with project developers identify specific impacts associated with wind turbine radar interference, and then how we identify mitigations to those. So turning to Tom Vinson from OEA, Tom, can you speak to what the industry's biggest concerns are when it comes to offshore wind development and the radar interference issue?
Sure, and maybe I'll start by just providing a little bit of context on how offshore is different than the land-based environment, that perhaps many of your listeners are familiar with how that's worked in terms of engagement on radar issues and mitigation options, et cetera. The one thing that's the same is business certainty is important. So as Steve and others have mentioned, the earlier developers learn about these issues, the better. So I think that's something we all share in common. But the size and scale of the offshore investments are generally significantly larger than what we see in the land-based space. Jim acknowledged in his intro that these are multi-billion-dollar investments. The projects are going to be generally in the 800 plus megawatt range, and while the turbines are going to be bigger, it's still 100, 200 potentially turbines, although some of the earlier projects are in the 200 to 300 megawatt range as well. And then the permitting timeline is much, much longer than land-based wind, and it's federally controlled generally, as we were discussing earlier with, if you're 3 nautical miles and out, you're under federal permitting. And as Jim noted, that can be 7 to 10 years from BOEM's initial area identifications to construction and operations plan approval, and then probably another 2 years to actually construct your project and have it placed in service. And so that is a long time for companies to tie up capital on development of a project with no income from that project. So that's why business certainty is so important. And it's a long way of saying that I think the biggest concern that developers have is finding out late in the process. And by late, I mean potentially as early as just after a lease award, or even worse, during the construction operations plan review, the NEPA analysis that Jim mentioned that the other agencies are a part of. If you find out then that you have significant radar concerns, that's going to be a huge problem. And the reason for that is because companies have bid on their leases. BOEM auctions the leases. It's a competitive bidding process. Companies have bid into those auctions with some assumptions that they've made about the developable area, potentially how many turbines they may be able to put there, things like that, that leads them to make a bid that they think is sufficient to allow for economic build of that lease. And if significant portions of that lease suddenly become unavailable due to a later radar issue, that's going to put in doubt the economics that were relied on up front. In addition, companies are bidding into state solicitations that Jim referenced earlier well before they have their projects fully permitted in many cases, and certainly before they have their COP approvals and things like that. And so when they bid into those state solicitations, they are also making assumptions about how many turbines they can have, turbine spacing, layout, et cetera. And while they may only be bidding a part of their lease area with the idea that they will phase development in over time, it can still be very problematic for the economics of that lease area if later on in the process there is a radar issue that they were not aware of earlier in the process. And then finally, they also have to spend a lot of dollars lining up, both on the development and design, but also in lining up procurement arrangements for supply vessels, for example, for lining up their contracts for their survey vessels or their installation vessels, their turbine supply agreements and things like that. And they have to do that well in advance, multiple years in advance of construction generally, just because the timelines are so elongated when compared to land-based wind. So as others have said about the importance of early engagement, I think for the developer community, it's really important to understand these issues as early in the process as possible, including in that first stage that Jim showed in terms of wind energy area designations, and then scaling down to the lease area designations within those wind energy areas.
Thanks, Tom. That's great. That's great context from the industry side around how early these issues need to be addressed from the project development perspective. I wonder if any of the agencies have specific reactions to that on how we can get these issues addressed early. Maybe I'll start with you, Jim, and then move to Steve.
Sure. I think those are excellent points that Tom is making. The whole concept of consultation as early as possible and issue identification as early as possible so that it can be identified and shared with potential developers on an upcoming auction is critical. There is inherently a lot of risk that developers are assuming as they move into the auction and development process. And insofar as information is available, I think the onus is on us as federal agencies to ensure that we've identified everything we can possibly foresee that might be issues for development. So I think Tom's points are right on the mark, and I think that's why we indeed do pursue early consultation through our intergovernmental state task forces, which are composed of federal agencies as well as state and local agencies, so that those issues are out on the table, and insofar as we can study them and mitigate them ahead of time, that is definitely the preferable route.
Great, thanks, Jim. Steve, anything to add there from the DoD perspective?
Yeah, thanks. I think both Jim and Tom have really explained it well. I agree. I know from the DoD side, especially with how long, big and slow moving these projects are compared to what we deal with on land, there's really no reason to be surprised about DoD's position on a project. We should be able to identify very early on, at the very minimum, what emissions might be impacted by development. And that's going to really tell you what's possible, right? So if we're talking flight obstruction, we can look at that mission and see, is this a mission that is tied to ground infrastructure? If so, where is it? That's going to affect the flexibility of compatibility in very specific areas, or is there some flexibility to move things around? If it's radar, we have tools that we've been using onshore for a very long time to predict impacts. We still use those same tools for offshore. We will be using them for offshore. Right now, we're looking at some studies to give us some certainty as to whether there's any differences. When we do a predictive model right now onshore, does the difference of the environment and lay of the project offshore affect the accuracy of our tools that we've been using onshore? So we're looking at those, but it all comes down to, if we get to this early, we'll be able to identify what the issues are, if any, and if so, that will help the developer figure out what the challenges are and what level of risk and what opportunities there are with each of those challenges. Over.
Great, thanks, Steve. George or Derek, anything to add on the how we can address these issues early front?
Sure, this is Derek. I'm not sure that I have anything additional other than, as far as helping industry understand early engagement. It actually will help us as well as we look for sort of annual and longer term budgeting cycles to better understand the magnitude of the problem and the flexibilities on both sides. So we would also benefit from early engagement. So.
That's a great point. Thank you, Derek. George, anything to add?
Patrick, not really. I think Tom hit it quite well. I think we in the Coast Guard try to be very cognizant of their timelines, the developers' timelines. There's just certain things that we can't provide to BOEM or the developer unless we have obviously certain information up front. For example, the size of the wind farm, or the orientation of the wind farm, or the spacing of the wind farm. And we realize that's in a certain part or at a certain point within the actual project timeline. So, but the earlier we can get that, hopefully we are making ourselves as available. I think that's the biggest thing is and identify the right person or the right unit within the Coast Guard as to who the developer should be talking to, at least at the early stages, because eventually things do get funneled through headquarters that have to go to BOEM and over to Jim. So again, we try to make ourselves as available as possible. We do participate in every one of the state task forces that Jim identified. So again, we're trying to be cognizant and make ourselves available to industry.
Hey, Patrick, Tom, with the follow-up that may be worth exploring a bit as we go along. The other difference, I think, between land-based and offshore is in the offshore environment, for those preliminary stages that Jim talked about, and area identification, wind energy area, et cetera, you don't actually have a leaseholder at that point, right? So the incorporation of risk into pricing by developers into auctions, all of the agency stuff needs to be publicly available in that earlier portion. So any developer that wants to bid on a lease area, for example, can understand what the risks are with that particular parcel. And that's very different in the land-based context, where you've got developers that are doing all the prospecting themselves, can go to DoD on an informal basis based on areas where they're looking and understand where there are issues. In this case, you've got a lot of developers that are going to be competing for federally proposed space. So there may be some differences in how we need to collaborate and identify issues on the earlier stage versus when you actually have a leaseholder and can talk about what they may be willing to do for specific mitigations, et cetera.
Yeah, that's a great point to bring up, Tom. I wonder, Jim or Steve, do you have any specific reactions on how we can incorporate those in the sort of pre-leasing process so that that's available to developers when they come bidding? Jim, you first.
Sure. Again, it's a very good point. We do have situations where, of course, there are no leaseholders and we're looking at the potential for leasing, but it doesn't prevent us from doing an assessment of the potential issues in the area. And our process with the intergovernmental state task forces with state and federal entities is really precisely designed for that purpose. Early on, before we've even identified a call area, we meet with the state agencies and with the federal agencies, including DoD and Coast Guard, and say there is interest in developing wind energy offshore. One of the issues that we have to address here, and more exactly, what is the information that we need to collect in order to be able to put something out that increases the certainty on the part of bidders so that they can indeed move forward? We're not going to be able to answer all of the questions, but by the time we go through the process of identifying a wind energy area, eliminating areas that are clearly in conflict with hard conflict with other uses of the ocean, and then moving to a lease sale area potential there. Hopefully that process has identified, insofar as we know, all of the issues that we can put forward at that time. The problem, of course, is that if the communication ends there, additional issues are going to come up, and unless we're in a position to move forward on addressing those additional issues, the project could have a problem. But our process accommodates consultation early and often, and it also accommodates the early activity of agencies like DoD and like Coast Guard and NOAA, and hopefully it'll minimize the potential for conflict down the road.
Great, thank you, Jim. Any of the other agencies want to add anything to that on how they specifically are participating in making this information available early?
So this is Steve from DoD. I'll chime in. That to me sounds like a natural evolution of what we've been trying to do, all of us together, over the last decade, as we've tried to scope out areas. I know from our side, our term was site-specific stipulations that we would put in, saying if you were to seek development in this area, these would be the likely compatibility concerns and the stipulations that would overcome them. One of the challenges is when you're dealing with early and generic information, you have a tendency to, be very conservative and say, this big swath of area is all impacted by a specific development, where once we start to have better fidelity, we can start to tighten those areas down. So that's always the challenge. When you're dealing with more generic information, you get more generic answers. But I think that we've gotten better fidelity of that over the years, and DoD's happy to continue that. We're trying to get the word out there at whatever information you can give us, we will provide DoD's position. Over.
Great, thank you, Steve. Derek or George, anything to add?
I don't really have anything. I think it's exactly what Steve said. Very early on, we're probably the same way. We look at a particular wind energy area, and the first thing that comes to our mind is, okay, what shipping is in that area, and how concentrated is it? And because up until the time you have wind farms, mariners can pretty much go wherever they want. And now we're trying to, I'll put the word in quotes, kind of corral them a little bit, because if you're going to have wind farms, they're going to be prevented from going wherever they want to go. So what is that impact? Is it too great? Is it too hard? Are you going to push vessels to other areas where they really shouldn't be going? So it's those type of things, especially early on, is very hard for us to do. We try to look at the AIS, the automatic information system data that we have, and try to make some educated guesses and say, you know what, probably not too bad over here. And we obviously communicate that with BOEM, and hopefully that does help. It may not be a complete evaluation, but it's the best that we can do at the time. And then we try to get better. And of course, again, the developer is going to be looking at pretty much the same thing, especially when they're doing a navigation safety risk assessment for us to review. So we realize it's further down the road, but nonetheless, it becomes more refined as the process moves on.
Great, thank you, George. Tom brought up the good point that there's some significant differences between the process for how radar interference issues are dealt with in the land-based development context versus offshore, and getting to the sort of the technical side of that from a mission impact perspective. I wonder if the agencies can speak to what specific radar emissions you see being impacted in the offshore that you're concerned about relative to what you would see land-based. So what's different about the offshore wind context from a radar interference perspective for you all? And we'll start with Steve again, maybe.
Okay. Well, I won't repeat what I just said about whether the mission that we're doing is tied to ground infrastructure or fixed infrastructure, since I already said that. But your question was what types of radar and what's the difference offshore?
That's right.
The biggest difference I think right now is that the areas onshore that we have concerns about radar are areas that have a lot of development already, so it starts to become cumulative impacts. For offshore, obviously we don't have a lot of development already, so we're still getting way ahead of it, right, in most cases. If there are a few areas where test missions have been situated in ways that are offshore because they don't have the interference and the traffic and the shared space that we might have on land. So in those areas, it might be a stretch just to call it a radar issue. It's more of a technical issue. It could be all types of systems impacts that might be an issue, whether it's airborne or fixed. But other than that, we have, so broadly in DoD, we say either testing or training or operations. So if we want to keep that categorization, we have test missions that can be airborne or fixed radar that you tend to have fewer mitigation options because it's more of a lab environment. Then we also have for training, air traffic control. The airborne systems could be an issue there as well. We have yet to, I believe, I can't recall a time where we've raised airborne systems on training yet. So I'll generally say air traffic control for that. And then for operations, we've had NORAD's surveillance mission, which as of right now, I don't think is wildly different than on land, right? The same systems that we use to assess whether or to predict impacts and to overcome impacts on land are the tools, the predictive models that we use for offshore. And then also the radar off of the coast of the Chesapeake and Texas facing southeast that relocate. I'm sorry, I forgot acronyms. Relocatable over the horizon radar that's used for a SOFCOM counter drug mission. That is a unique radar that has some unique impacts that we're working through, and we've had some good partnership with industry in trying to get our hands around that. But that's all I can think of right now for the types of radar that to answer your question there, Patrick. So I'll hand off to the next.
Great, thanks, Steve. Derek, we're going to get into HF radar in a minute, so I'm going to pass to George first. George, if you can you speak to the extent to which, wearing your DHS DASA hat for a second, how those impacts might differ offshore in terms of the specific radar issues that you're looking at, and then speak to Coast Guard specific, the radars that you care about from the Coast Guard mission perspective.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. I'm not overly technical when it comes to radars, but it seems to me it makes a lot of common sense. If the wind farms are located such that, and based on the height, and obviously they're starting to become taller and taller based on the size of the turbines that are going to be used, and that technology is growing and improving and enlarging every day. So I think that type of thing would affect CBP a lot if in fact it does affect the land-based radar that's trying to in effect protect our coast. The idea being that maybe planes can hide right above them and not be seen until the last minute, and those type of things. Again, I'm not super technically savvy on that regard, but it seems to make much sense. As Derek mentioned earlier, from the Coast Guard side is the IOOS. We use a lot in our search and rescue mission, especially for search patterns. When we're out trying to find someone in the water, we need to be able to have that data plugged in to give us the latest information, such as drift rates and things like that. We're not quite sure how the wind turbines would be affecting that. We're going to trust our NOAA counterparts to really look at that as well, because they know our need. They know what our need is for that. And like I said, especially for search and rescue, so we will try to look at that as well. So again, as far as those type of radars, the land-based radars, I think those are the biggest impacts that I can mention at this point.
Thanks, George. Can you speak to how the Coast Guard views that? I know we've gotten a lot of interest on this webinar series about marine navigation radars. Can you speak a little bit more in depth about what you may see as being the issues there?
Sure, Patrick. Very early on, when we were starting to get into this, starting to get educated in this process, and I mean about the wind energy industry, is we had discovered from our counterparts across the pond, especially in the UK and in some of the European Union, is that there was the potential for marine radar, and what I'll refer to that as, obviously radars that are on vessels, on all types of vessels, that there's some kind of interference or potentially some interference. The Coast Guard conducted a study based on the first project, the Cape Wind project, the best that we could, bringing over experts from Europe as well as in the United States, and try to look at it. And some of the issues are, do we really have the data, the really scientific data, or do we have anecdotal data? And we kind of had both. So we had to try to, for the Cape Wind project, to kind of look at what kind of impacts. Marine radar in general, the impacts could be anything from clutter, radar reflections, blind spots, maybe shadowing, scattering, those type of things, and actually physically just, blocking, and even on a visual basis as well for a person trying to operate their vessel. So those are the kind of questions that we have to try to look at. We've done some studies. We had one that obviously DOE paid for out of the University of Texas very, very early on. We've tried to analyze the European studies that exist. The issues becoming, though, is that those are becoming very dated. And so is there something new that we should be looking at? Very possibly. We're not sure how that would be done, but it may need to be done. Of course, there's mitigations that can be identified as well. Everything from education of the mariner to tell them, hey, this is what you may experience. To experience, mariners just are going to have to possibly go in wind farms and understand the dynamic and go through. And can we mitigate? It's even been identified that possibly the location of the radar on the vessel may impact that radar's ability to quote unquote see better. And so those are the type of things that we're going to have to learn about. And again, maybe along with the industry that develops those type of radars, what kind of mitigations can we do? Can we help the mariner operate your particular radar or those particular radars to get, in effect, the best picture that they can?
Great, thank you, George. And just as an administrative note to all of those folks who may have dialed in partially or primarily because they're interested in this marine radar question, we're still wrestling with how to address that in this webinar series. And stay tuned and happy to take your feedback on that front. Jim, and maybe this is a question for Jen Miller, your SME on this as well. Can you give a quick overview of the study that you all just funded, looking at what radar issues are likely to be of greatest concern in the current lease areas?
Sure, I would indeed like to transfer this over to Jen because she can give a much fuller answer, but the initial study identified that the line of sight radar issues are the ones that are most predominant and can indeed be mitigated. Jen, are you on the line? She might be muted by.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. Thank you.
Okay.
And so yes, I'm happy to answer that question as much as I can. We did fund a study that looked at a number of our lease areas and the specific plans that were presented in the construction and operation plans, or that we are aware of at the time of the study. And from the results of those studies, it looks like the high frequency coastal radars are the systems that pose the most likelihood of seeing some interference. As mentioned, we've done quite a bit of work looking to try and find mitigation solutions for that series of radars, but at the moment, those are the ones that look to be the most impacted. In addition, the areas sort of in and around New York City also appear to be the areas with the largest number of radars that could potentially be affected. I would like to point out that our leases are located relatively far away from these on-land assets. However, that doesn't mean that they're out of the radar line of sight. And so I think our expectation at this time is that we will, when through the COP review process, we expect developers to come up with a level of assessment of impact for their particular study, and then work directly with the radar owners and the assets owners to try and come up with mitigations and solutions that are mutually agreeable. Does that make sense? Did I answer the question?
Yeah, that's great, Jen. Really appreciate that. And thanks for jumping in. So Derek, Jen just mentioned that the HF radars that you mentioned are likely to be of significant concern and could be significantly impacted by offshore wind development going forward. Speak to why those wind turbines are a concern for HF radars and how you analyze those effects.
Sure, I can give that a shot. So I think the first field study that really attempted to quantify that was the one that's been mentioned before, the BOEM study, based on the Block Island configuration. And from that, we learned a little bit about the mechanisms and the signature of the reflection that the wind turbines cast into the radar return signal. So that was enough of an insight into the mechanism to give us some hope that this was a solvable problem. In fact, based on that study, we kind of convened our community and asked them for a plan for mitigation, and they came back with a pretty resounding yes, this can be fixed. There's a lot of complexity, and every wind farm and the geometry of the individual turbines, the rotation rate, the angle of the blades and everything is a complicating factor, but also the configuration relative to each other, like how dense they are, how far they are offshore. Our longest range radars can go up to maybe 200 kilometers offshore. And so that kind of gives you a sense of the scale. And let's see what else. The simulations that were built on top of that Block Island study were pretty preliminary and pretty specific to that configuration. So I think the next level of the research to be funded and implemented is, can we make those models a little bit more sophisticated and a little bit more representative of the actual size and shape of the wind farms that we expect? We need to do some ground truthing to, get other types of instrumentation in the water to see how these mitigation algorithms are working, how successful they are. So that's another part of the study that NOAA will be funding in the next couple of years. So all that to say, we do believe it's a solvable problem, but there's a lot of information that we need in order to make the algorithm successful.
Great, thank you, Derek. And just as from the perspective of the WTRIM working group, I think that's a great little vignette of how in general we end up working through these issues. So thank you for that perspective. Tom, I wonder if from the industry's perspective, if there are particular radar issues that have come up in the course of your work, or that you've heard about from your members that folks from the agencies haven't listed yet, that you all are seeing as potential issues, either in projects that are under development now or going forward.
No, not necessarily new ones. I mean, obviously, understanding the air traffic control issues, the air defense issues. I think the Missile Defense Agency radars is maybe one that's we haven't experienced in the land-based context. So, unclear to me today whether that's an issue or not. And obviously the marine-based is a new issue because we don't have that in the land-based context. But I think our sense is the studies do indicate, as George sort of alluded, that there are available mitigations, both from a training perspective, but also from a technical side in terms of radar and antenna location, proper calibration of the radars and things like that. So, and I appreciate Derek's comment on the HF radar, that even though that has been a relatively newly identified issue, and I think it was important to have the conversation earlier about how do we incorporate newer identified issues into this process, because we've had that experience in the land-based context as well, where at the time we didn't know what we didn't know. But I think that report, my takeaway from that report is that the potential impacts are predictable, and that there were a variety of pathways to mitigation that were identified. And appreciate Derek's point that there's still a ways to go on the data side to make sure that the mitigations work as expected. But my sense is for the existing lease areas that there are no showstoppers on the radar side.
Thanks, Tom. Steve, do you want to respond at all to the question about whether early warning radar systems may be an issue going forward?
Sure. Well, I heard Tom mention NDA. I mean, we've had NORAD, NORTHCOM, SOUTHCOM, Joint Staff, Missile Defense Agency as part of our process for a long time. Missile Defense Agency probably less involved, or at least didn't need to get as involved. But a lot of that's driven by where development increases. We don't do the same missions at every location across the country. So we haven't mentioned Navy ship traffic, just because the nature of this discussion is most radar interference. But every issue that comes up within DoD, we consider as part of the clearinghouse process. So as something comes up in a new area, it can invite new issues, even though those equities were part of our process the whole time. They were asked and said, I don't have an issue. I don't have anything that I have to worry. So we came back to the developer without referencing that. So, as I think that for the offshore, there's been a lot of advanced planning as we've looked at the areas in various data calls over the last decade. We've identified those issues. So, identified the emissions in each area that could be impacted. So I'm not seeing any surprises. We've not had any showstoppers that we hadn't discussed were a compatibility challenge before, like Rother off of North Carolina and Texas. But I don't see any big surprises there. So we're happy to keep working through it.
Great, thank you, Steve. So ask a couple more questions here about how mitigations. So we say we've identified. You guys have identified the issues that you're concerned about, and obviously we've talked a lot about the importance of getting those on the table as early as possible so that they're built into the planning process from a developer's perspective before they're even going and putting money down on a lease. But obviously there are concerns that make it through that process, and I'm wondering if you all can speak to how specifically developers can work with you both through the BOEM process, but also on an industry to agency basis to come up with mitigation measures and get those accepted. So Jim, I wonder, could you speak to that first, and then we'll turn to the rest of the members of the agency panel.
Sure. That is a great question. There is a process in place, but it all comes back to the early and often communication. Insofar as we are able through that process to identify issues and have all of the right players involved, that helps us get to an identification of a mitigating measure that we can incorporate into approval of the construction and operations plan. That is not to say that it has to be a huge committee of federal agencies that constantly meets on the one topic. The technical interface between the respective agencies and the developer can identify mitigation that may be acceptable to both parties. I do think that BOEM has a key role in bringing the federal agencies together, or the particular agency that may have a particular issue, so that it can be incorporated into the development plans, into the construction and operations plan of the developer in a much more effective and timely manner than a fragmented process between the developer and many different federal agencies. So there's both the one-on-one, but bringing it together so that the developer knows the federal government is speaking as one voice, ultimately, so that the mitigation can be incorporated and the project has greater certainty over the long haul.
Great, thank you, Jim. Steve, I know you all from the DoD perspective work bilaterally with developers on these issues. Can you speak to how that works and how that fits into the BOEM process?
Sure. Right. As you know, we don't have any approval to give anybody, right? So what we will do at the end of at multiple points through this process is report back to BOEM whether there's a national security concern with the project, and the best thing that we can do is work with the proponent to overcome any. Let's face it, in many cases there won't be a risk to national security, but in cases where there are, if we've set in place a mitigation measure for the identified impact, that's the best predictor of success right there. We have, one of the challenges is, we are trying to get our equities and our challenges and our compatibility concerns out there as early as possible so that we can put in place mitigation strategies. The one challenge with that is when you're talking early, there could be other development that comes into place at the same location or nearby. So if we have 3 developers talking to us in adjacent areas, and 2 of them look like they would be fine, what do we say individually to each of the 3? So since we don't have an approval or denial to give any of those 3, what we do is we let everybody know these are the concerns that we would have. We tell BOEM these are the concerns that we'd have. This is what we'd do about it. And then as those projects are proposed, because who knows, even if all 3 of those would come through in the first place. So we have to deal with the best information we have at the time, and we identify what the concerns are. If there's cumulative impacts that we can predict, we'll let you know that, so that can be rolled into your risk assessments. And then also another reason that we have to keep talking even after you get this early consultation is radar analysis doesn't really lend itself to generic tests and answers, right? We need specifics, and we know you don't have them up front, or if you do, they're going to change. So as you get better fidelity, this is the kind of thing that it's an ongoing conversation. Don't expect to come to DoD early on and get one piece of paper that you're going to hold on to for 10 years saying that we're good. I know people don't expect that. I'm exaggerating, but the point is that as you tighten things up, we're going to update our assessment based on your new information, as well as the new information of potentially cumulative impacts in the area. So it kind of fits in with what Jim said about it's an ongoing process. The best thing we can do is be clear about where we stand. We're all learning. I think we're doing a better job now of documenting these things rather than just having an email from somebody in DoD that says looks good. You'll at least get a formal letter back from the clearinghouse telling you what DoD's position is. And then if we need to tighten it up or continue discussions on it, we can do that. But at least you'll have something in hand that sort of memorializes the discussion so that we can know what it said and what it didn't. Over.
Thanks, Steve. George or Derek, any further perspective from your agencies on how developers might work directly with you on any mitigation issues and how those might ultimately feed into the BOEM process?
Sure. I'll jump in because I wanted to reiterate something that Steve just said. I think I saw 3 primary opportunities. We need to do site-specific modeling. As Steve said, things change. The information you have about the configuration of the farms now will change as you get closer to construction. So that's an ongoing process, and that changes the models that we'll use to assess interference. Another one that's related to radar, but it's also a little more encompassing, is a general data sharing agreement. We've been approached by some developers to kind of build a relationship with NOAA as the primary ocean archive center for the nation, so that we could take data that's being collected as part of your site assessment and initial operations, construction, et cetera, and make that available to the public. So being able to do that both magnifies the value of the data that you're collecting. You only get one shot at observing the ocean, so we want to make sure that we're using that to better understand the ocean from a scientific context, but also to inform these operational decisions. So data sharing is a huge one. And the third is the fact that these sensors and the ships that are going out, or these platforms and the ships that are going out to service them, are both huge resources for observing the ocean, right? One of the differences between the land-based systems and the ocean systems, the ocean wind farms, is we know so much less about the underlying physical environment that you're going to be operating in the ocean than we do at land. So anything we can do to outfit any of these platforms or the ships that service them with sensors will increase our ability to do day-to-day operations, but also understand the impacts on the radar systems. So those are the 3 that I came up with.
Thanks, Jarek. Any thoughts from you, George?
Just pretty much what's been echoed before. Again, we want to work with the developer. I know the industry is aware of the potential impacts to marine radars, but there are mitigations. We need to identify them. Some of that is actually having the developer work with the particular user group that's going to be in that particular area. That may wish to transit through a wind farm or very close to the wind farm, so that they're aware of what potential issues could arise. But for the most part, I think, again, it's in some respects, it's kind of a big hole because there's so many different types, different manufacturers. So to kind of come up with things that are generic may be a little bit more difficult than we think. We are aware, obviously, that there are vessels that transit around and through wind farms in Europe, and they do it relatively safely. There's been very, very few documented cases of any kind of accidents in Europe. So they must be doing something right. We probably need to look at those as well, and what mitigations did they put in place for the marine radars. But again, footprints, from my opinion, footprints, spacing, marking, lighting, those type of things go a long way to help mitigate the potential radar interference that can happen on the marine radar.
Great, thank you, George. And something you said brings up, I think, a really good point that if folks or panelists on the webinar have any thoughts, I'd love to pull those out. And we mentioned that we've learned a lot about how marine radar issues have played out in the UK and EU context. I wonder if the other agencies could speak to, relevant to your missions, what have you seen come out of the much greater level of experience that's been gained in the EU and the UK with respect to the offshore wind radar interference issues? And Jim, let's start with you and go to Steve then.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm not going to be able to speak so specifically to radar issues. We've learned an awful lot of things from the European models, both leasing models and some of the technical items. I do think that the radar issue in general can be very, very specific to a particular area and a particular radar type, as we've heard earlier. So we've got a lot of situations where we have to work things out on a case-by-case basis. But I would like to open the mic to Jen if she wants to add anything with regard to radar-specific lessons learned from Europe.
So Jen and then Steve.
Yeah, I don't know anything specific to take away from the European experience, except for the fact that it looks like, with proper planning and communication, that there are workable mitigation solutions so that both industries can feel whole. And I think that we can do our due diligence to make sure to keep the OCS a safe place for vessel operation. That's it.
Thanks, Jen. Steve, any thoughts there?
Yeah, as part of these efforts through this forum, and I know inside of DoD, whenever we're scoping out a new study, a big part of getting started is looking to see what's been done elsewhere, what's right for more study, and the UK studies have been part of that. So I think there's been sort of an incremental, sort of a back and forth on figuring that stuff out. I don't have one big aha moment from the UK studies, but they're certainly part of our source pool as we're looking through these things. And then procedurally, we've seen, the Ministry of Defense actually has a permitting role, and that is one of those things that kind of be careful what you wish for, because they've got to review a whole lot of projects and actually weigh in on approving and not approving them, and that opens up a whole can of worms that DoD has not sought. So yeah, it's all part of the process of seeing what other folks have done and what they've learned from it. as we heard from Ørsted and the participants on the first webinar, they're wrestling with a lot of the same issues, and I think some of the ones that they thought they had moved forward on have some. There's still some of the same challenges, so we're working together. Over.
Great, thank you, Steve. So before we move to wrap up, a lot of really great questions from the audience about how these considerations are likely to change going into the future. Obviously, Jim, when you guys are looking at leasing and approval of an offshore wind farm, you're talking about a piece of infrastructure investment that could last 30 years or more. How are you all thinking about how to manage issues like this in that context? So if something, if we got new radar systems coming along, or there's a new issue that's identified after a wind farm goes into operation, how do you address that?
Well, we do indeed have the ability to go back in and require changes as might be appropriate based on new information or technological developments. And we do have the responsibility to keep track of these sorts of things. I want to touch on an example that Steve gave, which is right on the mark, is that you might have 2-3 different project proposals, and the synergistic effect, or the effect of one project on another, which was previously unforeseen, may indeed become an issue, and we have to address that issue. We also have to identify that issue exists, so that we can identify what the appropriate mitigation might be. And this is going to be an ongoing process as the industry develops and as the technology develops. And insofar as new projects come on board, they may be indeed restricted because of some of the constraints that are associated with other projects. But insofar as we're able to identify these new issues, we need to incorporate them into the project review and the COP approval process.
Great, thank you, Jim. Any other thoughts from the agencies on how you may be thinking about these issues, say a decade or more out?
Yeah, this is Steve. I'll share. The part that we think about on this is, if we all work together, there can be this is really from the DoD side on our mission. If we're all working together, there can be a lot more development and a protected national security mission. And that sometimes means having areas that are left more pristine, so that missions can be performed there. That frees up other spaces too. So if we're just doing this where there's not a well thought out plan, and it's just kind of I don't know, for lack of a better example, whack-a-mole, right? A project comes up and then we go run over there, and then a project comes up, we run over there. You can end up with very little development that has a huge impact, rather than the alternative, which is smart development that has considered these impacts along the way. So we don't have, obviously, the authority, but what we do have is a voice to share it with. We want to make sure that what we're telling BOEM and what we're telling industry is the same thing. Everybody's clear about it, and that's the best thing we can do. So as we look forward, you can kind of guess from where we've had issues that that's where we're more likely, as development continues, our options to overcome those issues are going to diminish. But other than that, it's kind of similar to land in that we're rarely going to have, or at least less likely to have, impacts with small projects or a small amount of development. But when you reach a certain point, the technical impacts may be such that it exceeds our ability to overcome them. So that's why we're having calls like this. We're trying to see what our options are, and we're trying to make sure that both industry and Department of Interior understand what DoD's position is. Over.
Thank you, Steve. And I'll use the power of the chair here and take the mic for DOE's perspective on this real quick. One thing that I'd encourage folks to do is go out and Google the Federal Wind Turbine Radar Interference Mitigation Strategy, which is a document that we and the interagency working group use to help us coordinate our efforts and prioritize them. And one of the things that document speaks about is the need to make sure that as new radar systems are being planned, and it's because obviously we're dealing with a legacy system that in some cases we're dealing with sensors that are decades old, and that will eventually be replaced. That these issues are coming into their process of development very, very early on. And so that's something that DOE has been focused on through the working group. We're also, there's a lot of research and development that we're looking at going forward as part of the working group to, as these issues come up, or as we can, or as we're learning about what impacts might be possible, what mitigation measures might be out there, that we're funding research and development early, so that by the time those systems come online, the capabilities are in place to address them, so that again we can move forward in a way that the states and the country can meet its renewable energy goals, and that simultaneously we can make sure that we're protecting critical federal radar missions. And so with that, I want to thank all of the panelists here, Steve, Derek, Jim, George, and Tom, for all of their insight on the session today, and move on just briefly to touch on where we're headed next in this webinar series. So Alex, if you could advance the slide, please. We've obviously been talking for the last hour and 55 minutes about the role of wind turbine radar interference in the federal offshore wind project review and approval process. Next, we're going to turn to getting into the technical nitty-gritty. It says from an agency perspective, I think it's likely to be broader than that, around what we understand from a technical and scientific perspective about how offshore wind interacts with the different kinds of radar systems that we as federal agencies really care about, and how or what our understanding of potential mitigation measures might be for those different systems. I think the way this will probably work is we'll have these webinars grouped by systems. So for example, you might see a webinar specifically around the marine radar issues that we've touched on a couple of times, or you might see a webinar about air traffic control and air surveillance radars. And so we'll deal with those on a system by system basis over the next couple webinars in June and July. You see the next webinar tentatively scheduled for the 29th of June. One thing I want to remind everybody of is that, as I had mentioned at the beginning, this is very much a work in progress from our perspective. We're really interested in hearing from folks in industry, from federal agencies, from other stakeholders on how we can make this dialogue more effective at getting at the issues of how we, ultimately can overcome the wind turbine radar interference issues, so that wind development and radar emissions can continue to coexist effectively in the U.S. So to that end, really would like your feedback on how to best do this. You'll see Lily Gobriel, who is part of the administrative team that's so ably helping us organize these webinars. Her email is down here in the lower right-hand corner. Please send her your thoughts. And we look forward to speaking with you again in June. In the meantime, as a reminder, as soon as we're able to get everything together, we will post these webinars on our website. I posted a link in the chat box here earlier in the webinar. where you can find those. We will send out a link as well when those resources are available. And we look forward to speaking with you on June 29th. So thanks again to the panelists, and thanks again to all of you for your time today. We'll talk to you next time.